HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Impudent Ones, a novel, by Marguerite Duras, with Jean Vallier. Translated from the French by Kelsey L. Haskett. Read by Suzanne Toren. Translator's Note. This note is intended to provide additional clarity to the family relationships described in the novel, as well as to its setting. The Taneran family is composed, first of all, of Mrs. Taneran, previously a widow with the married name of Grant, who brought two children into her second marriage, Jacques Grant and Maud Grant. When Mrs. Grant married Mr. Taneran, they had another son, Henry Taneran. Altogether, they constitute the Taneran family, more frequently known as the Taneran family. As well, Mrs. Taneran is often referred to simply as Mrs. Taneran, and her first two children simply as Maud or Jacques Grant. The novel begins in the family's apartment in the Parisian suburb of Clamart, with Maud looking out the window toward another Parisian suburb named Sèvres. The story soon moves to the area around Eudorant, the family estate situated in southwest France, and returns near the end to Clamart. One final change in location takes place to complete the novel. Part 1. Chapter 1. Maud opened the window, and the distant sounds of the valley filled the room. The sun was setting. It left in its wake massive clouds that clustered together and rushed blindly toward a chasm of light. The seventh floor, where they were living, seemed breathtakingly high. The view around them revealed a deep and resonant landscape that stretched right out to the somber streak of the hills of Sèvres. Between this distant horizon, crammed with factories and suburbs, and the apartment high in the open sky, the air, brimming with a fine mist, appeared thick and murky, like water. Maud stayed by the window for a minute, her arms stretched out on the balcony railing, and her head tilted to the side in the pose of an idle child. But her face was pale and etched with boredom. When she turned back toward the bedroom and closed the window, the humming of the valley suddenly stopped, as if she had closed the sluice gate of a river. At the far end of the dining room stood the buffet. It was a very ordinary piece of furniture, from the period of Henry II, but with time it had taken on the role of a silent character in the Taneran home. It had followed the family, and they had eaten their meals off its chipped dishes for more than 20 years. Its style and the disorder that reigned in its shelves revealed a strange absence of taste. It was obvious to anyone who saw the buffet that the Tanerans never chose or bought furniture, but made do with average-looking, more or less suitable pieces of furniture that had haphazardly been passed down to them through various inheritances. Thus it was that they gathered around the Henry II-style buffet on the evenings they arrived home from their trips. And those evenings were always the most trying, because they realized that they hadn't yet left each other, and that their old sideboard continued to observe them like the image of their despair. Tonight, on the buffet, the statement addressed to Jacques Grant from the Tavares Bank lay waiting for someone to open it. These statements regarding his debts often came at a bad time. This was an especially bad day, because Jacques had just lost his wife, Muriel. She had died that very day, following a car accident. Jacques was weeping in his bedroom, abandoned by his family, for it concerned Muriel, whom they knew very little, and each one possessed, besides their personal reasons for not reaching out to him, a reason common to all the Tanerans, a kind of contemptuous mistrust with regard to his expression of pain. So Maud didn't go in to see Jacques, even with the excuse of the statement from the bank. Moreover, it seemed to her that the statement's arrival wasn't entirely bad timing. It bitterly highlighted the fateful character of this tragic and lethargic day. In the dining room, things like her brother's overcoat, scarf, and hat lay around in disorder, thrown over chairs. These finer objects always surprised Maud because they were so different from her own things. From the dining-room doorway and down the dark, bare hallway came the sound of Jacques' sobbing. Maud listened attentively, her tall frame leaning against the window and her face alert. She was attractive in this pose, and her beauty emanated from her face like untamed shadows. Her pale, overly wide forehead made her gray eyes look even darker. Her face, with its skin stretched out over her prominent cheekbones, was attentively immobile. Maud felt nothing except her heart, which was beating heavily. An irresistible disgust churned inside her, but her body held it in well, like the solid banks of a torrential stream. She listened to her brother's sobs, this elder brother, who at 40 was 20 years her senior, weeping like a child. He had married Muriel barely a year ago, and this marriage constituted the most important event of his life, for he had never accomplished anything else. Since attaining his majority 20 years ago, he claimed jokingly that he had been content to put up with his family. Mrs. Grant Taneran readily accepted the idle and dangerous life her son led, but on the other hand had never forgiven him for marrying a woman from the world he frequented. Although their quarrels were once quickly resolved, with Mrs. Taneran revealing her influence over him each time by calming down almost magically in the face of her son's growing indignation, this was no longer the case. Maud sensed their mother's presence, alone, in the depths of the apartment, entrenched in the kitchen, her last place of refuge. There was no sound coming from the kitchen, but Maud knew the noise of the sobbing cut through Mrs. Taneran's apparent silence. And considering the time this ordeal had lasted, since 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and it was already 8 o'clock in the evening, the devastating effects of the sobbing must have been considerable. The doorbell rang. The young woman went to open it. Her half-brother Henry poked his head in with a childlike movement, barely showing his angular face and brown hair, and looking like the spitting image of his father, Mr. Taneran. From Maud's low voice and the uncustomary calm that reigned, he guessed what was happening. "So, it's over? Leave them alone and come with me. Let's get out of here." Maud refused. She turned on a small lamp beside her and waited. Shortly afterward, with the sound of a grating key, Mr. Taneran emerged from the shadows of the apartment hallway. He had a short mustache, a bit charred-looking, with despondent eyes, set in a face carved with wrinkles as pronounced as scars. He was thin and rather stooped. At one time, Taneran had had a respectable career teaching natural sciences at the high school in Auch. Upon retirement, he had married Mrs. Grant, who was living in the city where her first husband had worked as a tax collector. Taneran was just returning from the Ministry of Education, where, at over 60 years of age, he had been obliged to take up work again in order to meet the heavy demands that, since his marriage, had completely absorbed his personal fortune. In reality, his family had easily adapted to his sacrifice. It should be added that since he had started working again, Taneran had managed to escape a little from the tyranny of his family and felt quite pleased about it. He had never become used to the inevitable constraints of family life, and lived, moreover, in constant fear of his stepson, Jacques Grant. If he had not hesitated to marry Mrs. Grant, even though she already had 2 children, it was because he had assumed that the older one would soon be getting along on his own. He and Mrs. Taneran had had another son, Henry, for whom he felt a great deal of concealed tenderness, although Taneran quickly had to get used to the idea that his feelings were not at all reciprocated. Thus, to all appearances, Taneran lived a very solitary life. On entering the apartment, he too understood that something unusual was going on, and approached his stepdaughter in the hope that she would fill him in. "If you want, I'll serve you dinner right away," was all Maud felt like saying. At that moment, Mrs. Taneran called out in a weak, husky voice, "Maud, serve dinner to your father. It's ready." The young woman hurried to unroll a wax tablecloth, set a place, and enter the kitchen. Her mother had finally turned on the light and was reading the newspaper. Without raising her head, Mrs. Taneran repeated in a gloomy tone, "Everything's ready. You can eat with your father, and if your brother Henry comes back, you can serve him too." Maud did not acknowledge that her brother certainly would not come home that night. Dinner was quick. Taneran wanted nothing more than to retire to his room. Nevertheless, he asked Maud in a low voice, "She's dead, isn't she?" Maud nodded, and he added, "Fundamentally, I don't feel any ill will toward him. It's very unfortunate." He was masticating his food, and in the silence of the apartment it made a bizarre, irritating noise. Before going out, he turned and said, "I don't want to disturb your mother. Please say good night to her for me." His bedroom and the dining room shared an adjoining wall. Maud could hear him walking in his room for a long time. Under his feet, the bare floor made a gentle creaking and cracking noise. Maud felt at peace. For too long trouble had been brewing. That is, ever since Jacques and his wife had begun to be short of money. As far back as she could remember, Jacques had been in financial difficulty. Except for the first few months of his marriage, he was always in need of cash. This was by far the most important thing in his life. He existed in the center of a whirlwind, his head spinning over money. Whenever he had any, he became another man. He possessed such an acute sense of his own inanity that he spent recklessly, throwing money out the window, deluding himself by using up funds in a few days that could have lasted a month. He smartened up his wardrobe, invited all his friends, and, with the magnificent disdain that his temporary opulence allowed him, didn't appear at home for a whole week, avoiding this family who knew how to stretch out money so shamefully, so miserably, like others who hold back on using their full strength or enjoying pleasure, or like a dutiful servant who spares his masters any grief. When he no longer had anything left but a few bills and some change in his pant pockets, he bitterly measured his slim possibilities. He would set out on the hunt, trying to pawn off a friend's old jalopy, and, not succeeding, would turn to gambling, going flat broke right away. Finally, worn out and unapproachable, he would put himself into the hands of the members of the gang that had followed the same leads as he had for years, and knew all the rackets. Perhaps they were the only ones who felt any sympathy for him, although he detested them because they had seen him in the most shameful moments of his life. His wife's money had disappeared as fast as the profits from his shady affairs. For several months the couple had led what one would call a futile life, because it made no sense, but which in reality is very difficult to live. An idle and perfectly egotistical life, even though it appears generous, which consists of an uninterrupted series of moments of pleasure and respite, a continuous exorcism of boredom. Muriel, who had entrusted her fortune to her husband, always remained ignorant of the ways in which he used it. She detested expense accounts and never bothered with them. Jacques was soon rushing around like a madman, trying to cover expenses he had allowed himself to incur. Soon he began to beg. The little his family could give him had become appreciable of late. "I know you can't give me much, but do what you can. 100-franc bill will be enough. I just need to hang on." "I thought your wife was rich," countered his mother. "Don't you think I have enough expenses already?" He didn't answer so as not to spoil things, guessing that his difficulties were on the rise. And indeed, Mrs. Taneran had let go of less and less money, at the same time that her son's needs continued to grow. This money, obtained through promises and pleas, represented more and more of the essentials for Muriel. Stockings. She has nothing left to wear. The rent, or money needed to redeem a piece of jewelry, part of her family heirlooms from the pawnshop. In the end, he stopped coming up with reasons to justify his demands. They had to eat, and again he found appealing ways of making his requests. "She's a wonderful cook, poor dear. If only you could taste her cooking. You'll come, won't you, Mother, when we have a bit more money?" "What about me? Don't I know how to cook? You're saying you didn't like my cooking? Go on, say so." Mrs. Taneran detested him because love contains the dregs of hatred. In the end, she wasn't unhappy with his romantic misfortune. It didn't take long for him to start playing highly emotional scenes. Stretched out as if he were sick, he would wait for someone to come and ask him what was wrong. "Nothing. It's nothing. But I won't go back home tonight without a thing. She's no doubt waiting for me, but I prefer not to see her again. To disappear." The gang he had left a few months earlier had let him down, and so, acting on a supreme sense of family solidarity, his sister, brother, and stepfather all dug down to the bottom of their purses or pockets, all of them, Maud, Henry, and even Taneran. They gave him, secretly, 20, 30, or 50 francs, with a feverish joy. He took pleasure, however, in vexing them. "Mother went along with it?" "No, she doesn't want to hear any more about it." Unshakable as well as astute, Mrs. Taneran had thus guided her ship and governed her son's destiny. Soon, loathing his own home with Muriel, he had come back for dinner more and more often. His mother never gave him too much money at once, so that he didn't have the impression he could control her, but always just enough for him to have the essentials, and so that he would return. Suddenly, however, he disappeared for a couple of weeks. They thought he had succeeded in some business deal, and it was shortly afterward that the saga of the mail with the letterhead from the Tavares Bank had begun. The letters came regularly, every 4 weeks. Although leaving him indifferent in the beginning, while he still had money, they soon threw him into a terrible state. Someone who has never experienced the feeling of being at the mercy of creditors cannot imagine the deadly aversion these greedy people inspired in him. The whole family suffered with Jacques when they saw the statements arriving from the Tavares Bank. Normally, Jacques received his mail at his wife's place, but this mail he had addressed to his mother's. "Have a look on the buffet. There's a letter for you. I think it's the request for payment from Tavares." He would bury it in his pocket, crumpling it and seemingly digesting the piece of paper for an hour, literally. He sank into sickening daydreams in which it was easy to guess that Tavares himself had become the victim of a massacre. And then, for a certain time, he stopped coming to get his letters, believing he had thus done away with their existence. But he quickly found himself so destitute that he had to accept coming back. Right away his mother cornered him. "Can't you tell me what you've done, Jacques? After your father's death I had to borrow, and I know how tough it is." The only thing he had deigned to reply was, "It's a debt with short but frequent due dates. In my situation I could never have paid a big amount all at once." Why all this secrecy? Why not tell your wife? Mrs. Taneran would have liked her daughter-in-law to suffer, in turn, from the agony of being in debt. But Jacques had not involved his wife in any questions regarding money, and for good reason. By the same token, he had never wanted her to know his family, because it repulsed him. She had died without visiting even once. No doubt Jacques had loved her more than any other, and in a more sincere and lasting way. For a long time, Muriel had kept up the image of the ideal woman that she had had at the beginning of their relationship. The tragedy had erupted this particular night, brutal and unexpected. It was probably going to resolve the tangled mess they were trapped in, and strangely facilitate its elimination. In reality, each one had expected this conclusion throughout the months that Jacques and his mother's ordeal had lasted. Toward 10 o'clock in the evening, Maud heard her older brother calling her. As she approached, Jacques lifted his swollen face and then sank back into his pillow, finding himself there, as it were, at the heart of his sadness. His suffering absorbed him as much as it prostrated him. He was no doubt amazed that it was possible to go on living with this sorrow. She sat down beside him and partially opened up his tense fingers, grabbing a strand of hair that he was clenching. Immediately he slumped down, let himself go slack, and moaned in total abandonment. "No doubt about it, she was a true blonde," said Maud. "Her hair was smooth and fine, like a child's." He gave a weak, almost complicit smile, to show her she had fully grasped the direction of his thoughts. He cast off his pain for a moment, and smiled at the memory of Muriel. Maud explained to him at length that he shouldn't consider this death to be an unusual event. What was extraordinary was that, as she spoke to him, an inner voice repeated her own words, which took on a different meaning than the one she wanted to give them. As for Jacques, he wished only to bring back the memory of the deceased. He described that horrible night when she had been brought to him with her chest crushed. "The chums who were with her brought her back to me," he said. "They left her with me because they thought she had had it. But even though she had lost consciousness, she was still breathing, and I kept her all night before taking her to the hospital." He stopped from time to time and then resumed, looking absorbed in his thoughts. "She didn't have any wounds, so I thought she had passed out. I put her under the covers, but little by little she got cold, and I felt the warmth of her body leaving her. I thought at a certain point I was going crazy. She was laughing, I swear, the same way as when she made fun of me. I began to talk to her idiotically all night. It was only at daybreak that I understood. When I looked at her in the light, I saw the grimace I had taken for her smile. I took her to the hospital. She didn't die until this evening." "What do you think?" Maud asked. "I have no idea, none. She told me she had never been so happy. But there's no reason to think it was an accident. The street was free of traffic, and it wasn't raining. Even the chums are in doubt. I never caused her the slightest bit of pain, though. She was the only one I ever loved." He readily repeated the last sentence. As soon as he shook himself and stopped being absorbed in a very private contemplation of his sorrow, he began to cry again. "The only one," he kept repeating. "The only one I ever loved." Being embarrassed, he didn't know quite how to express himself. "I called you because I don't have a cent. I had to borrow so I could have her better taken care of. And you know I can't ask Mother for that." Maud looked at him with his big, lucid eyes, his face devoid of all expression. She thought about the letter from the bank that was waiting on the buffet. They had already given him so much money. Didn't he always skillfully extract some benefit from the emotions he caused? In the past minute, he had been playing up his misfortune to his advantage. She hesitated, however, to leave the room. It was astonishing to see him lower himself to this point, just to get a bit of cash. And, of course, she might be mistaken. Jacques himself, who seemed so pitiful, probably remained convinced of his own sincerity. Finding her composure again, she weighed the pros and cons quickly, like someone who is used to these kinds of deals. Already Jacques' look had hardened because she had been slow to reply. "How much do you want?" He specified the amount in a small, humble voice. He felt obliged to add, his eyes glistening as much from crying as from greed, "I rushed around all day trying to hunt down some dough, but there was no way to get hold of any of my buddies. It's ridiculous. For an amount like that, ridiculous." Maud didn't answer. She got her purse, counted the little money she had, and replied, "You'll have the rest tomorrow." Embarrassed, she avoided looking at him. She didn't hand him the bills, but just put them on his chest. Chapter 2. Jacques buried his wife the next day. Mrs. Taneran accompanied him. They felt suddenly reconciled upon returning from this bleak ceremony. In the coolness of the morning, the sap made the buds burst open, and puffs of air already carried the odor of hot tarmac and dust. The smell made one's nose tingle, and put winter far behind. Summer was coming, early. Jacques and his mother talked about leaving for Uderan. "That will put you back on your feet, dear, and at the same time I can keep a closer watch on my own interests. Besides, we haven't gone for such a long time." Jacques didn't say anything. He already felt his strength returning. Since his childhood illnesses, he had never again appreciated the comfort of convalescence, and almost dreaded the moment when his insatiable nature would take over. For now, he let himself glide happily down the gentle slope of the sunny boulevard he was descending on his mother's arm. He should have been sad, but he wasn't, really, although he didn't mind being consoled, while his stiff bearing and toneless, dreary voice expressed a decency he felt proper to keep for some time to come. Because he remained quiet, his mother added, "As for Taneran, he'll get along fine without us, since obviously he won't want to come, as usual." When she mentioned her husband to her older son, she always called him Taneran. Uderan was in Dordogne. The Tanerans had settled there after their marriage. Henry was born there. Although the purchase of the property had soon proved to be a poor investment for them, they had nevertheless lived there for 7 years, and had never thought of selling it. When they had gone to live in Paris, despite the low income derived from the tenant farmers, they had kept the place. Mrs. Taneran remained the only one who occasionally remembered its existence, whenever she feared the future darkened by political events. "Happily we have Uderan. Blessed are those who possess land," she would proclaim sententiously. They had lived through some long, difficult years, confined to a few rooms of the house, which was too big. For 7 years they devoted themselves to restoring the estate, but Uderan had belonged to a whole series of people,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?